There are several different approaches to conducting survey interviews or polling interviews. The original, developed in the 1930s, uses face-to-face interviews. In these cases, interviewers actually go to your house, knock on the door, find out who lives there, and then randomly select someone to interview. Those face-to-face interviews still exist today, but they're extremely expensive. And so for political polling work, are almost never done, or for media work for that matter. About the only people that can still afford to do face-to-face interviews are government agencies. So the National Health Survey, for example, is a multi-million-dollar effort that uses face-to-face interviews to get top-quality data and very lengthy data. Also, in some face-to-face interviews, biomarkers are recovered. So a swab inside your cheek to get a DNA sample, for example, is done in some of the current survey research. But for most purposes, and certainly all political purposes, the advantages of face-to-face are small compared to the huge increased costs. So that brings us to the second method of interviewing, the telephone. Telephone sampling methods actually go back as far away as the 1920s. But really only came into common use in the 1960s as telephone usage permeated nearly the entire public and as cost issues drove people to use telephones more than to use face-to-face interviews. Now we distinguish between the classic telephone method, the live interviewer telephone interview, which, as the words would suggest, involves a person on the phone asking questions. Those kinds of interviews frequently last anywhere from 10 minutes to maybe 30 minutes, or even 40 in some cases, but fairly lengthy with a live interviewer interacting with a person. More recently, automated telephone interviews, or what's really called interactive voice response, or IVR surveys, have come to the fore. Here, Survey USA, the Rasmussen Organization, and Public Policy Polling, or PPP, are three of the most widely seen and most ubiquitous survey organizations doing IVR research. In these cases, a recorded voice asks the question, and whoever picked up the phone at the respondent's house responds. So, do you approve or disapprove of the job Obama's doing as president? Press 1 if approve, press 2 is disapprove. The difficulties with those are a much lower response rate than you get with a face-to-face or a live interviewer, and you have no control over who's answering the phone. Maybe it's the family dog pushing the buttons. So this is simply not known in IVR calls. One other drawback to IVR is that federal regulations prohibit calling cell phones with an automated caller like this. And so by definition, IVR polling always leaves out cell phone only respondents, a group that generally are included in modern live interviewer telephone polls. And finally, a method that didn't exist before the late 1990s, online interviews over the internet. Here the difficulty is that it's still impossible to construct a random sample of the population for online purposes. Instead, internet samples are almost all constructed from volunteers, people recruited to participate in the survey through email, through ads at websites, and so on. What's called a panel is constructed that may consist of, in some cases, 2 or 3 million people as part of the panel. And then for each survey, a random sample of that panel is taken, and those are the people that are then interviewed over the internet. The problem with that is that if you've started with a non-random panel of 2 million people, even if you randomly select from those 2 million, you still don't have a random sample of the population as a whole. The advantage of online surveys is that they are relatively inexpensive to conduct. Certainly each survey costs very little. There can be very quick turnaround time, and you can collect questions about people early. For example, their age, their education, their race, their religion, things that don't change much over time. And then you don't have to ask those same questions again when you re-interview them about a political campaign or about laundry detergent several months later. The final kind of poll that's a special poll is an exit poll. These were pioneered in the late 1960s, early 70s by Warren Matofsky, then of CBS News. And the exit poll consists of the idea of starting with a polling place and then interviewing a random selection of people as they come out of the polling place. The polling places are selected randomly from throughout the state, and then you interview every 5th person or every 10th person or every 20th person that comes out of the polling place. In this way, you construct what is, in fact, a probability sample of the electorate, and you're not at the mercy of people to tell you whether they voted or not, or even if they were at the polls that day, because by definition, you know they are at the polls, they're walking out, and they almost certainly, therefore, voted. The downside is that it's a brief questionnaire. Not everyone participates. So of these different methodologies, from purely technical perspective, the ideal is the face-to-face interview. You have the highest response rate, the greatest control, the lengthiest surveys, and the ability to have a live interviewer interact with the respondent. Second best is probably the live interviewer telephone poll, but there response rates have fallen substantially in recent years, so that now a live interviewer telephone poll would have a hard time getting even a 20 or 25% response rate. That brings us to the IVR, the automated polls. There the response rate can be under 10%. And it's a real question of whether the 10% who agree to do an IVR poll are really representative of the public as a whole. So this is a real downside to the IVR polls. And finally, the internet polls suffer from the inability to construct a legitimate random sample, a probability sample, because the sampling frame is not well defined. So these are the ways that we're conducting modern polling. Each has advantages and each has disadvantages. In the end, the methodology is a trade-off between what's the technical ideal from scientific purposes and what is financially feasible and therefore something that we can do and get the information we need.